hiring excellence for me is just being deeply more human, being centering your culture and over communicating, being very, very clear about expectations and also over communicating praise and recognition.
Welcome to Offer Accepted, the podcast that elevates your recruiting game. Your host, Shannon Ogborn, interviews top talent acquisition leaders, uncovering their secrets to building and leading successful recruiting teams. Gain valuable insights and actionable advice from analyzing cutting-edge metrics to claiming your seat at the table. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Offer Accepted. I'm Shannon Ogborn, your host, and this episode is brought to you by Ashby, the all-in-one recruiting platform empowering ambitious teams from seed to IPO and beyond. I am super excited because we have just such an amazing person here today, Anthony Holloway. He is a recruiter, coach, and entrepreneur on a mission to inspire and transform millions of lives around the world. Since 2016, he's coached 1,000 plus job seekers and helped them negotiate and discover the job of their dreams. His empathy for candidates is really largely driven by his experience as a career coach before his transition into recruiting. Currently, he leads global talent acquisition at Woebot Health, and Woebot is a mobile app that helps people with digital therapy. Such awesome work. And their mission is to make mental health care radically accessible. Anthony, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Shannon. I appreciate being here.
Amazing. Well, I know I gave just sort of like a little like scratch of the surface of what you're currently up to, but can you give our listeners some background on yourself and mostly, what your role is at Woebot?
Yeah, a little background about myself. I'm a East Coast boy, born in Virginia, raised in New Jersey. So I studied mathematics, actually, believe it or not. And one of my first jobs was in a bank. So I think that's actually where I learned about candidate experience and hospitality and learning how to treat people really well. And then, as you said, in 2016, I became a career coach. And that's where I gained a lot of empathy for what candidates go through and the bad rap that recruiters get, unfortunately. So I vowed to myself if I ever became a recruiter, I would try to do it better than what my candidates experienced that I was coaching. And that's what I've been doing for the past 5 years.
Amazing. I love that so much. One of my favorite things is hearing about recruiting and recruiters' origin stories and sort of how they got into this space. So I love that. But I know in your time as a recruiting manager, so kind of what your more current work is, are there any particular challenges that have stood out to you or anything that's come up that you've said like, okay, this is a gap that needs to be addressed?
Absolutely. And I think it came from experiencing it myself initially, but I think the biggest challenge other than, as Ashby talked about TA teams or being challenged to do more with less, I think another big challenge is just productivity, right? How do you stay productive? And not only how do you stay productive and keep all the plates spinning as a recruiter, how do you continue to create a remarkable recruiting experience despite all of the wrecks or all of the spinning plates that you got to keep up in the air? So I think one of those biggest challenges that not only that I've experienced, but I've had to coach other recruiters that have reported to me on is how to manage their time, how to manage their productivity. And yeah, I geek out about this topic. So I was really excited when you and I spoke offline about diving deep into this.
Yeah, 100% productivity, I think, especially these days with doing more with less, teams really need to be thinking about how they can well manage their time, but also make sure that they're not burning their people out and, making it so that there is a lot of unnecessary turnover. So I'd love to hear from you. And that's just one of the reasons why productivity is so important and kind of the context around it. But tell me a little bit more why you feel like productivity is so important in kind of the context of why companies should be focusing on it.
Yeah. So I think there's three big reasons. There's a lot. So I had to whittle down this list for sure. But the three that come to mind for me are the first comes from a great book that I read for the first time this year called The 1 Minute Manager. But it was a quote and it said, people who feel good about themselves produce good results. I think that's the first part of productivity. The second, which I thought about after our conversation, Shannon, was your head count is 80% of your overhead, right? Which we can dive deeper into, but we invest so much into, you know, reaching our market, investing and researching our competition, right? All those things are important. But if we underinvest in our people, then we're going to play a losing game. And I think the third one is you mentioned on it and touched on it, Shannon, briefly, but more and more knowledge workers are experiencing burnout, right? And the World Health Organization is calling it an occupational phenomenon. So you have organizations that traditionally study disease that are looking at burnout because of how rampant it is globally.
To the last point, I feel like burnout has been such a status quo in work, especially in tech for such a long time. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation because I think that mindset shift is really necessary to, to sort of carry this forward. Any other anecdotes that you feel like are important to contextualize this, concept of productivity and work, especially as it relates to recruiting teams?
As it relates to recruiting teams? No, I mean, I think the first point says a lot and covers a lot, right? People who feel good about themselves produce good results. And if I don't feel like if I feel like I have too many regs and I'm not making progress, and then priorities are shifting, and now I have a new thing, it's deeply human to want to make progress on things. And when we're managing so much, it can be hard to do that, and then burnout can be very hard to solve and to even identify because burnout isn't just your working hours. And I think that's what people are starting to learn more and more as more research and more studies start to come out. It's not only that, it's your feeling of autonomy. It's your feeling connected to the value and the worth of the role. It's your ability to feel like you're making progress. So again, burnout isn't just working hours. And a lot of folks, PTO is important, but a colleague of mine, Lindsay, that I work with, she talked about PTO being pause time off, right? Taking PTO without really addressing the underlying issue of burnout is like being in a toxic relationship and like saying, "Oh, we're just going to take a break." And then both of you leave, you don't do any work on yourself, and then you come back and expect it to work. So again, I'm not telling people to not take PTO, very important. But if you take it without really assessing why you feel burnt out, then you're going to come back and feel just as bad or worse than you did before you left your PTO.
Yeah, for better or for worse, we are not in the show Severance. We do we don't we leave work and it's still with us, right? Like how we feel is still with us. They both bleed into each other. It's and again, for better or for worse, there is that overlap. So addressing it is really important for your mental health, both in work and outside of work. But I know that we had chatted about sort of some mistakes that people make in productivity and how to avoid them for enhanced productivity. And we really kind of narrowed in on this on, in the context of recruiting and recruiting teams. Can you walk me through? There's seem to be kind of like three big areas. Can you kind of walk me through
Yeah.
what those are?
Absolutely. So when you and I had talked about this, and I have to give you some praise, Shannon, because I feel like I had 30 different ideas and you really challenged me to narrow it down. And because you challenged me, I feel like we landed on something that I'm extremely passionate about. So thank you for that. So I'm going to start high level at what those three mistakes are, and then we can unpack them a little bit more and more. So the first I feel is recruiters and their managers being calibrated on goals and expectations. And we'll speak more about how to handle that. The second that I've noticed and that I've experienced is a lot of inefficient communication with hiring managers and the interview team, especially if you're fully remote. And we'll double click on that. And then the last one is an inability to context switch effectively and set boundaries. And again, when you're a recruiter, context switching is the name of the game. But let's start from the top and then we can work down, Shannon. So when I say calibration on goals and expectations, what I mean is, and what I've learned is that there aren't necessarily unreasonable goals. There's often unreasonable timelines, right? So getting out of your own head and getting clear on progress is really, really key, especially if you're a manager and a leader that is helping others, because most of us are walking around with narratives and expectations in our head that we don't necessarily share with others. So there's a three-part approach that I take to trying to coach other recruiters and also set expectations as a leader. So I like to think of it as like a golden triangle. Things in life, we remember things in threes. If I had a fourth thing, you wouldn't remember it. So number one is, does your recruiter and does the people you lead, do they know the expectations that you have for them? So that's number one. And you need to communicate that. You need to repeat it. You need to document it. And then you need to communicate it again and continuously do that. And when you feel like you're blue in the face from saying it, that's when people are probably starting to understand it. The second of that trinity is training and capability, right? So does this person know how to do this? Sometimes we often hire people, or sometimes we might coach people and just assume they know certain things that maybe they don't. And then the last thing is motivation and incentive, right? Are the right motivations aligned? And what I mean by that, motivation doesn't always have to be money, but have you prioritized this particular project or initiative correctly, right? If you haven't set the expectation, back to number one, that this is a priority, then why would somebody be motivated to do it? So I wanted to start, as I said, with calibration on goals and expectations. And an example of that, and we talked offline about this, Shannon, but say, for example, you were coaching someone who was maybe underperforming. And just for the sake of an example, I'm going to use your name, Shannon, but we know that Sharon is great. She's not in this boat. It might go something like, hey, Shannon, it's really not like you to miss your phone screen quota for the week. What's going on? Talk to me. Now, again, you notice, like, I'm not attacking Shannon. I'm kind of saying, like, actually, I expect more from you. I know you've done more. This isn't like you. What's going on? And again, that opens it up for Shannon to be able to explain. And now you can think about and listen to her answers and filter through those three options that I gave you, right? So you can listen and say, okay, as Shannon speaking, did I not set proper expectations? Or is she not clear on the outcome or the capabilities, and her skills maybe not up to par? Maybe I haven't really shown her how to use this tool the way I think I've dug deep into it. And then the last is of that example is she motivated, right? Are the incentives aligned? Have I prioritized this in the right way such that Shannon knows that this should be her number one priority? So again, the first one is calibration on goals. And then those are three ways that you can use as a framework to try to set better expectations and have coaching conversations with your people.
Like you said, until you're blue in the face, it may just not be clicking, or the expectation not be clear, and having that level set, I think, is really important. One of my sort of follow-up questions here, and this is kind of at productivity at large, how do you prevent, like, as a manager, people feeling anxiety about those expectations?
Damn, that's a really good question. How do you prevent people feeling anxiety about the expectations that you place on them? Well, again, I would probably start with having a one-on-one conversation. I would want to unpack that because, again, one of the things that I mentioned was the narrative that we tell ourselves, right? Again, burnout also can show up in, hey, the story that we're telling ourselves about the work, right? I don't know about you, Shannon, but I know I've been working on 4 or 5 recs at one time, and and just felt like my head was spinning. And I sat down with my manager, and she's been great, Don Marie. and she said, like she kind of has this sixth sense. So I can't expect every manager listening to this to have the sixth sense that she has. But I remember some of the questions that she asked me weren't, you know, weren't scientific, weren't metaphysical. It was just deeply human. She just said, "Hey, Anthony, like, talk to me. What's going on? Like, hey, like, I noticed that, you're a little on edge this week. What's going on? Talk to me." And again, when it's just, let's have a conversation, let's talk. If you really gently come into the conversation that way, it can go actually a long way. So it's not necessarily a special set of questions to really diagnose this. I think the Trinity that I mentioned really is really, really helpful. But Dr. Khalifa Oliver mentioned it in episode 18, I believe. But she said recruiting excellence is just being more deeply human, right? Centering the human at the center of everything that we do. And I think that goes for recruiting and that goes for like coaching, mentoring, and helping lead people. Again, when people know that you have their best interests, they can open up a lot more and lead to great things.
Definitely. I love that you've done your homework on previous episodes. The episode with Khalifa I thought was super valuable, and the human aspect of all of this, because productivity can feel very unhuman when you're, prescribing it to your team. But I think there is a way, like you've talked about, that really humanizes it so that it's like, I'm helping you be more productive so that you can feel good about your work. And you don't have to take this home in quotes, because home is, a lot of us are at home these days working.
Yeah.
But on expectations, so there's expectations of, calibration expectations on goals, but then there's also, expectations and communication with hiring managers and the interview team, which was kind of the second part of this. Can you walk me through a little bit of this sort of like mistake and productivity, and how people can avoid this mistake to be more productive?
Yeah. So we talked about the first one again, as which is calibration on goals and expectations. That second one, as you said, is inefficient communication with hiring managers and the interview team. And I think before you start to set expectations for this, I learned about, I forget who it's attributed to, but it's this model called with management called I do, we do, you do. So that's it. It's exactly how it sounds. So I think before you start to even notice, or before, people that you lead start to even have a chance to be inefficient in their communication, you need to set the example as a leader. I see too many leaders wanting things of their people that they don't necessarily demonstrate themselves. Right. So you want to praise and model the behaviors that you want to see. So I think I do is like, hey, like let me set that example of how I want my recruiters to communicate with my hiring managers. We do is like, okay, hey Shannon, let's sit down and like draft up a message to this particular hiring manager because yeah, their schedule is really busy. We want to be really thoughtful and we're going to do it together. And then it's you do, right? But too often, especially in startups, right, where we like to move fast and break things, as the saying goes, people just get thrown to the fire. Just like figure it out. You like not only will you not see me do the example, I won't do it with you. You're skipping right to you do. And that feels jarring. Like even when I explain that there's three steps and you're skipping to the last step, like you kind of understand it. But because we have so many goals, so many deadlines, we're skipping people right to like, you do it, figure it out. So I think that's the first big component of inofficial communication is leaders not modeling the behavior that they want to see. The second piece that I've seen, and again, my manager, she's historically been great at holding me accountable to this, is maybe you have a hiring manager. Again, let's use the example because most recruiters and leaders understand it, that hiring managers are busy, right? They have more than just literally the majority of their job isn't hiring necessarily, right? So the question that when I would come into my one-on-one with my manager frustrated, she would say, "Hey, do you have a regularly scheduled sync with this hiring manager?" If not, have you scheduled time with them, right? Let's not, hiding behind, Slack isn't going to do it, and Slack is great, but 50% of the time, 60% of the time when my manager asked me that question, my answer was no. And I would kind of just grin and just me and her would laugh because she wasn't chastising me, but I'm like, "Ah, damn, you're right. I need to be more proactive. So being more proactive with your communication. Also, the questions I like to ask is like, have you used something like Loom to deliver a video and make a clear, direct, short ask? Again, you can leverage the law of reciprocity there, right? Oftentimes I find that if I send a hiring manager like a video like that, they almost feel like, damn, like that Anthony took the time to do that. Like I should get back to them.
And
And
you're leaving no room for them to not know what to do. There's no
exactly.
space. You've given the exact direction.
So again, when it comes to inefficient, communication with your hiring manager, you also have to think, have you empathized with their workload, right? Like we're all busy, and honestly, in the past 4 years, we've all probably experienced some type of burnout. So empathize more with them. And often I found if I can go to one of their direct reports or maybe another manager that's working on a project with them, hey, I haven't been able to get a hold of Shannon. Do you know what's going on? Oh, well, she's under this tight deadline, like yada, yada, yada. And now I can empathize. Now I can maybe pump the brakes, follow up with Shannon on Tuesday. Thursday's not the day, right? Another strong example of that, because now I know I've taught conceptually, and I really want your recruiting leaders to have something tactical that they can walk away from. Again, I mentioned it, people who feel good about themselves produce good results, but that came from the 1 minute manager. And one of the tools that you can use is a 1 minute praise and a 1 minute redirect. So I'm going to talk you through each of those and also give you some examples. So the 1 minute praise is praising people as soon as possible and ideally trying to catch people do the right thing. Too often in work culture, we're trying to reprimand and catch people doing it wrong and correct it. But praise as soon as possible. And when you do so, let people know what they did right, be specific, express how not only what they did right made you feel, but also how it helps the team. And then here's the magic. And here's where I've had to learn and be coached and coach others. Pause for a moment and just allow people to feel good about the praise that you just gave them. And again, this moment is very key. And after that, again, just let them absorb that and encourage them to do more of the same. Remind them that you have confidence in them, remind them that you have their back and you support them. So an example of that, if I were to give Shannon here a 1 minute praise, I might say, hey, thank you for having me on the show, Shannon. Your feedback when we were preparing for this episode really challenged me to think deeper. I mean, it really did, if I'm being quite frank. And that made me feel like you respect my work and you believe that I could add value to the Ashby podcast. And that feels really good. Not only to be valued, but to also be challenged. So thank you, Shannon.
Thank you. That was very, very kind feedback. Now I just feel like my day's made.
And it took me 1 minute, 1 minute of in
Less.
intention. Yeah, less. So these are things that are quick practices. And again, I would urge everybody to read the book. But if you do nothing and all you did was really intentionally pay attention and deliver 1 minute praise, yeah, over a quarter, it would make a huge difference.
I also find that, well, it's important to know if people like public praise or for me personally, I've told every manager I've ever had this, like, I thrive on public praise. Like, it is something that makes me feel motivated. Not everyone is that way. Some people like it private, but like you should know your people, and your people should, typically they do know themselves to know which they like. But I found that in situations where there's interviewers who do a really good job submitting their feedback on time, and you praise them to either the rest of, let's just say, for example, the engineering team, or if you're a small company, the company, people feel really good about that. They're like, wow, my work is acknowledged. It seems like a small thing, but when you, as a recruiting team, acknowledge that interviewers are obviously a big part of the system, hiring managers are obviously a big part of the system, and when they're acknowledged for their work in the process, I think that they feel a lot more motivated to do better for their team, for the recruiting team, for the whole organization, and that's sort of the importance of the acknowledgement, like you've talked about.
I love that you called that out, which is like, there's so many layers to this. It's like praise people, but also be mindful of how people like to receive praise. And that's actually a question that I like to ask people, like how do you prefer to be recognized and praised? And yeah, I've gotten people on totally other ends of the spectrum that are like, I hate public praise. It makes me feel awkward. It makes me feel put on the spot. Like you don't know. But the have the humility to ask the question, I think is what you just called out, Shannon. So the second piece, the other half of this coin is a 1 minute redirect. So I know people are thinking like this one is a little bit spicier, but it's really not. It's the same exact framework, but with specific feedback on something that someone can improve. So again, similar to praise, you want to give a redirect as soon as possible. So what's really good to do as well is to confirm the facts and review whatever mistake happened together and be as specific as possible. Express how you feel about the mistake and its impact on the team and your results. And then again, pause and let somebody feel concerned. Again, these pauses are like actually strategic and really, really important. Let somebody feel concerned about, hey, this was a mistake. And again, this isn't to attack, this isn't to condemn, this is to say, hey, as Brene Brown said, clear is kind, right? It's kind to be extremely clear with people, and it's extremely unkind to not be clear with people. So remind them after this pause that you're better than this mistake. I've seen you rebound before, and I believe you can overcome this hurdle. And we're going to do it together. How's that sound?
Sounds
Again,
good.
took you less than a minute, and someone's extremely clear about what they need to do better and how they can avoid that in the future. And they feel, again, it's that human need to feel progress and to also feel kind of like part of a community. Cause I'm saying, hey, I got your back. Like it's okay to make mistakes. And what do they call that? Psychological safety. I think that's what that's called.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah, feedback with psychological safety is so important because if the feedback doesn't have psychological safety, that's what creates the anxiety we were talking about earlier. I think that a lot of this comes to overwhelm, whether it be the expectations, the inefficient communication, like all of it can cause overwhelm. And this context switching, I think, also causes overwhelm. Can you tell me more about like this inability to context switch, effectively set boundaries, and how someone could overcome that?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is something I have to be really diligent about myself. So I have a very intimate relationship with trying to avoid context switching. Many of us, and I'm speaking from experience, are trying to do 7 different tasks on one day. You're trying to have performance conversations with your people. Maybe you're interviewing, maybe you're scheduling, maybe you're doing debriefs, trying to get feedback from hiring managers or people who haven't submitted their scorecards. I mean, it's a ton, right? You can get overwhelmed just thinking about it. But what I found is that rather than trying to do 5, 6, 7 different tasks on one day, I've learned that, and I've learned to coach people on having solely different days for different types of activities. So I'm going to talk about 2 techniques that leaders can focus on. And again, I think with all of my suggestions today, try to model them yourself before you maybe ask or have others to try to do this as well. I think that's the best result that you're going to get for your buck. The first is how to manage your week, and then I'll speak more about how to manage your day and how I've coached others to do the same. So, in terms of managing your week, I read a great book a few years back called The Self Managing Company by a guy named Dan Sullivan, who runs a company called Strategic Coach. He's been a coach longer than I've been alive. So he knows a thing or two about a thing or two. But he said that you should have three types of days: free days, focus days, and buffer days. And he mentioned free days first. So the idea behind that is like try to be intentional, and at the beginning of the year or before your time for PTO comes up, try to think out like what time do you want to spend? Like, is there a vacation that you want to take? Is there something that you want to do with your kids? Even if it's a 3 day, 4 day weekend, it doesn't have to be a 2 week trip, but try to bake in like free time and something that you can look forward to outside of work before you fill your calendar and play Tetris with all the things that you need to schedule for yourself. So I think that's one, like having something to look forward to can actually, I think, make you more productive in your day to day. The second is focus. We're all familiar with this probably. People have read and heard of Cal Newport and his book on deep work, but you need deep focus hours of uninterrupted time to get a lot of great knowledge work done, right? And many of us are knowledge workers and are trying to do this more and more and more with our work, and there's more demands for us to do that. So focus is, for a recruiter, that might be interviews, that might be resume review, which I know Jim Miller loves. He told me that's his favorite. Sourcing, acting on feedback, like those are things that like I gotta remove my Slack notifications and I gotta put my head down and really focus. But then where people miss, Shannon, is buffer days. So these are days like specifically and intentionally for scheduling, for preparation, for follow-ups, for feedback, calibration, interview prep, like all it's like the work that supports the work. And oftentimes we're trying to do buffer work and focus work on the same day. And it feels like a car crash. So a tactical way that I've coached recruiters to do this is that one, I would sit one on one with them and I would say, let's pull your calendar up and literally just have them walk me through their calendar and why they have it set up in a certain way. And I would say, hey, like, so when do you take a break? And people like have like this blank stare on their face. What
They're
breaks?
like, "Are you kidding
So
me? Recruiters
are
don't
you
take
kidding me?
breaks." Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like the irony is that in order to, like, everybody wants to be more productive, but to be more productive, you actually need more rest and recovery. Think about like a high performance athlete, whether it's an Olympian or a world class, basketball, football, baseball, you name it. They take like their recovery is just as hard as their workout. They like athletes actually have to, especially Olympians, have to be like forced to take rest days because they don't know what to do with themselves. They're antsy. But it's a reason that they do that. It's because, hey, I can't just keep hitting the wall, work, 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 work. So the way I coach recruiters is I like to pull up their calendar, sit with them, talk through it. Again, I'm trying to empathize. I'm not trying to change their schedule at this point. So if I empathize with them and I really understand their schedule, then they'll be more open to some feedback and more open to some suggestions on what they can do. So just simply by having these three buckets, first modeling it yourself, and then starting to work with your staff and say, hey, like Shannon, let's look at your time. Let's think about how we put some more intentional breaks in your day. Let's think about how we have maybe chunks of your day where you're focusing more on buffer work, right? Preparation work that's going to help you be able to fully and deeply focus on those focus days. And again, you may not have the bandwidth or the ability to do all this on one shot. So you might have to say, hey, on Monday, half of my day is prep and half of my day is focus. And maybe the focus half is the first half of my day because I'm most present and my brain is fully functional in the beginning of the day. So that's one piece on the week.
I love all of this because I think you're providing a framework for someone to do what works for them. You're not saying like you have to do scheduling on X day. You have to do sourcing on X day. You're saying here's a framework for you to use. And I, as a neurodivergent person myself, find these types of things very helpful because for me, the context switching becomes super overwhelming. And so when I feel overwhelmed, sometimes I do nothing because I'm like so overwhelmed by how much needs to be done that then I just sit there being like, oh my God, there's so
I've been
much to
there.
do. Where do I even begin? And so I think, especially for some people who are neurodivergent, like these types of frameworks can also be very, very helpful in just kind of putting a method to the madness.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you have to practice these things. Again, I think that's, for your audience who's recruiting leaders, I think that's the thing that I really want to hit home, because it's not, take everything that I said today and try to go implement it tomorrow. It also starts, like all things, it starts with self. It starts with modeling these things. And again, I have all the frameworks and I still struggle with the frameworks. So it's not, hey, let's throw the frameworks at it, because it's the discipline of doing these frameworks and doing these practices regularly that then lead to ultimate progress. The second piece, closing out on the context switching, is managing your day. Because you can get really good at managing your week, but then the day comes and your day's like, I got different plans for you. Here's this challenge and here's this challenge. So for me, in terms of managing my day, I actually like to manage my day the way chefs manage their time. So last year, actually, I think 2022, I read a book called Work Clean. It's by Dan Charnas. It's a fabulous book because it's a guy who was a journalist who was fascinated with how chefs think and how chefs work. So mise en place is what chefs use, and it's a framework, again, just like the framework that I described, that chefs use to manage time and their space. Think about your favorite restaurant or your favorite meal. Every time you go to this place, you expect the same level of excellence and you expect your meal to be the same exact way. So chefs actually have a lot less leeway with their time than we do as recruiters and knowledge workers, right? They have to produce excellence every single time. So what you can use and what you can steal from chefs is called mise en place. It's a French term that loosely in English translates to everything in its place. And if you're a recruiting leader, I would again test this yourself, start to do it together with your recruiters. For me, I did this weekly with our recruiters, 20-minute sessions weekly for their first 45 days. And what I saw is that the responsiveness to questions from our hiring teams, that skyrocketed, because again, they were on it. They knew how to manage their time and they knew they had dedicated time to be able to reply and do certain activities. So 3 steps, again, you're sensing a theme here. 3 steps so people don't forget it. And I urge you to read the book. So a preparation step that I'm not including, but can be hugely instrumental in managing your time and your space, is cleaning your space. Like the first time I did this, I was like, I almost skipped it. I was like, why do I need, yeah, I don't want, get me to the productivity. I don't want to clean my space. But if you clean your physical space, that could be the desk, that could be whatever you work at home, or if you're hybrid in an office, like you get a small boost of productivity just from cleaning your space. Cause it's like cluttered mind, cluttered space, cluttered mind. We can get to your digital space next, but let's clean your physical space first. So you clean your space. So the first of the three is log, the second is sort, and the third is plan. So, and the log stage, that's kind of what people are used to, but this is where you're capturing new tasks. And this is where you need to have just a dedicated place. It could be pen and paper if you want to take it back to the old legal pad or the moleskin, or it could be something like Asana, which is a tool that we use at Woebot Health. But logging and creating again, it could be at the beginning of your day, end of your day, during your day, but that's going to help you develop a focus muscle. Because now when a task comes on your plate, you're like, hey, I got a dedicated place to throw it. And then as you begin into the habit of that, you start to create a more of a sense of control around your task. And you catch things that fall through the cracks. So log your tasks, then you want to sort them. This is where we usually extremely fail. Will log it, but then, like you said, Shannon, we kind of get overwhelmed, and then the apathy starts to kick in. It's like, oh my God, Anthony told me to log my tasks. I don't even want to look at this now. So this is where you go sort. And again, you can do these two separate time blocks for this, but sorting is classifying your task into priority and to type of task. So I'm going to cover type of tasks first. So you have two types of tasks, and a lot of productivity books don't speak about this. You have process tasks and you have immersive tasks. Most productivity books tell you to eat the frog, which I think one is just who would want to eat a frog? I get the analogy, I get the anecdote, but it never resonated well for me. So process tasks and immersive tasks. So immersive tasks are what we're used to. Immersive tasks are deep work. This is 1, 2, maybe 3 hours of undistracted, heads down work to push forward your most important tasks. Process tasks are like these hidden productivity nuggets, I like to call them. So process tasks answer one question, Shannon. Process tasks say, if I don't start this task now, am I preventing progress that could be happening on my behalf? I'm gonna say that again. If I don't start this task now, am I preventing progress that could be happening on my behalf? So for a recruiter, a process task could be, let me send out this calendar invite request to this candidate. Because if I start that now, then the clock starts for the candidate to submit their feedback. If we were thinking more like a chef, a process task is you're going to cook spaghetti and some garlic bread and some Caesar salad tonight. First thing you need to do, boil your water. It's a process task because if you start it, it can progress while you're doing a bunch of other things in the background. And then the priority piece is thinking about three sides: front burner, back burner, countertop. So this is how you prioritize. So I break all of my tasks into process and immersive. And then everything that's like, I need to get done this week, this month, that's going on the front burner. And hey, Shannon, I know you need that task next week. That's going to go on the back burner because I got some things that, and we're using the analogy of a kitchen stove here. And then everything else that can go in the kitchen sink, that can go on the countertop. I don't need to look at it yet. So you're kind of compartmentalizing these things. And again, this is how chefs organize space and time. This makes you have a system that you can trust. This removes distraction because you've logged, you've sorted. And then the last part is plan. So this is where you say, okay, I know what's number one priority this week, the next month. I know what's process versus immersive. Now I need to kind of play Tetris with my calendar and say, okay, what do I need to do today? What do I need to do tomorrow? How do I need to sharpen my tools? What resources do I need? So today I had, and you probably see me looking off the screen, but I had some notes prepared for our conversation today. So like yesterday, I was looking over those notes and I actually just pulled up the Google Doc with some of my notes and ideas. So I wasn't scrambling looking for it before our call. So it's like little things like this, kind of like these micro habits really build up and add up to a lot of value. So all of those help you plan with less stress, create a sense of control, and really reclaim your focus. So clean your space, log your tasks, sort and classify them, and then use your calendar like nobody's business.
My new catchphrase for myself is pre-work makes the dream work.
Woo!
You do
Got
the
it.
pre-work, the dream works, it feels cumbersome sometimes to do so much before, but it just makes the task so much easier in the end with higher quality as well because you've done all the things to get there. And what I love most is that you read all these books and you've tried all these things and you're kind of you've created like an ultimate culmination of all of the things that you've collected, which I love so much. But I would love to take a big step back because we've gotten like super in the weeds here. We talk a lot at Ashby about hiring excellence. And whether it's in this context or otherwise, I would love to hear more about, just quickly, like what does hiring excellence mean to you? Like when you hear hiring excellence, what does that mean for you?
I'll preface this by saying, like, having watched many of your episodes, like, I was the most excited and nervous for these last two questions. So, and I say that with great admiration and great respect. So, when I think about hiring excellence, and again, like, I've had weeks to think about this. So, I tried to come up with this great list, but I kept coming back to these two things. And the two things being culture and communication. And I'm going to just unpack it really quickly so I'm really clear with what I mean here. With culture, what I mean by is, as leaders, and again, it's really on us as leaders, clearly defining what behaviors you encourage and what behaviors you don't encourage, right? Simply put, like, what do you praise and, like, what do you condemn or punish or give feedback on, right? So leaders need to get really clear on modeling these behaviors that we want people to demonstrate, praising the behaviors that we want to see more of, and giving, again, as I said earlier, we got really tactical, giving redirects for mistakes and behaviors you won't tolerate. Because so many bad behaviors, especially in startups and when you're moving fast, go get ignored. Right. So for example, if no one on your leadership team will hold managers accountable to documenting feedback, why would managers document feedback if there was no consequences? Right. So leaders really need to get clear on what you encourage and what you don't encourage, because that's your culture, right? That's that nebulous thing we call culture. Second is communication and excellence around communication. And that's just practice, practice, practice. That's coming to the table with humility. That's coming to the table with empathy. Because I'm sure you've seen it, whether you've worked at big companies or startups, Shannon, 70 to 80% of most problems come down to miscommunication, right? Us not communicating properly, unsaid expectations. And again, I said it earlier, Brene Brown said, clear as kind, right? So, and I think especially as AI continues to proliferate, it's becoming increasingly more important that we be more human. Again, Dr. Oliver spoke about that on another podcast, but that means that the curiosity, the humility that you bring to conversations, that means seeking to understand and then to be understood, right? So hiring excellence for me is just being deeply more human, being centering your culture and over communicating, being very, very clear about expectations and also over communicating praise and recognition, right? Because if you're not clear about those things, again, people are going to create their own narratives.
Yeah, especially amongst recruiting teams. Recruiting can often feel like such a thankless job. And when the culture emphasizes how important recruiting is and gives praise to the recruiting team specifically, those recruiters are so much more motivated to go out there and do the work because they feel like they are respected and appreciated internally. But I'm super excited, and like you said, you've had a couple weeks to think about this, so I'm on the edge of my seat here. What is your what is your recruiting hot take?
Would you hate me if I gave you two?
No.
Okay,
No.
cool.
I
All
could
right.
I could do a full podcast just on hot takes
On
alone.
yeah, exactly. I bet. I bet. All right. So I got two hot takes and a prediction. Maybe you've never
All
gotten
right,
one of those
let's
before.
go.
So first hot take is, it's not about you. Be of service. Like, yes, we need to perform. Yes, we're recruiters, but the more we decenter ourselves and say, hey, like, this thing that I'm trying to accomplish is not about me. I'm here to serve others. How can I be of service? I feel like that has not failed me in any domain that I've worked in. It's actually how I got on this podcast with Shannon. I watched the podcast. I said, you're great. Jim Miller's great. Here's what I loved about your podcast. How can I support you? And Shannon said, would you like to be on the episode? And I was like, what? So be of service. Try to go out of your way to serve others and realize the work that we do as humans It's not about us. It's about serving others. And you figure out what best way for you to do that. Second hot take, 90% of cover letters are useless. Please stop sending them to me. I hate cover letters. I know, again, that's a touchy subject. Some hiring managers swear by it. Like, I don't want to look at a candidate unless they gave me a cover letter. I'm like, they're trash. Like, anyway, and the prediction that I have is if if recruiters don't think more about thinking more like marketers and educators, they're going to get left behind. So what I mean by that is that because we're so connected online and because we're so globally distributed, you need great content to be successful, right? I.e., offer accepted podcasts, right? Externally to attract candidates, but also internally to educate your business on expectations, which again, I know you had a whole nother episode where a woman was speaking about, hey, how do you educate the business on recruiting and expectations? And a great content does one of two things. It either educates or it entertains. And ideally you can do both. But I think recruiters got to get good and recruiters got to get in their marketing, their educator bag. Examples of this, like we talked about earlier, could be like loan videos, educating your hiring managers, right? Doing a podcast. Like I actually love to geek out about marketing and it really influences how I show up as a recruiter. So be sure to think about how are you educating people, not only potential candidates, potential customers, but also your internal team. And a good way to do this is just spend more time with your team's marketing division. Get close to them, try to empathize with them. And yeah, those are my hot takes and my predictions. I hope I've done you service, Shannon.
Yeah, no, I love it. It's funny because on a previous episode, me and one of my longtime career mentors, Heather Doche, who is a partner at Signifyer now, her and I have disagreed about cover letters since I think since the day we met. So I'm definitely more on your track, mostly because personally, having the time to review cover letters is nearly impossible for recruiters. And in my mind, if I can't review a cover letter for every single candidate, it makes the process unfair if I only review it, for a couple when I have the time. So that's I'm trying to like sort of build that equity in doing the same thing and having the same data points for every
Love it.
person. And I know that one's is definitely super controversial, but I appreciate you sharing. But we are coming up on our time here. Where should people go to learn more about you and your work?
Reach out to me on LinkedIn, Anthony L. Holloway. And yeah, seriously, like send me a DM. I love connecting. It's exactly how I got connected to Shannon. So if you need help, I would love to be of service. I would love to help you. And as you've seen today, I got plenty of book suggestion I can give you. So please reach out to me on LinkedIn. That's the best place to find me.
LinkedIn is the place for recruiters for sure. But Anthony, thank you so much again for joining us on Offer Accepted. This has been so valuable. I really appreciate you spending time with us, and I think people will be able to make some real tactical changes with your advice here. So thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Shannon.
Thanks for listening to Offer Accepted, the podcast for ambitious recruiting professionals, brought to you by Ashby, the all-in-one recruiting platform. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow and share with your TA community. We'll see you next time.